Hello, this is The Writer and the Writer's Workshop, and this is my seminar paper. My name is Josefina Longoria, and the title of my seminar paper is Gothic Fiction, Shirley Jackson's Anti-Heroine's Unresolved Psychology. So let's start at the beginning. For centuries, oral tradition has been used by parents and grandparents to transmit values to future generations. And there's many forms of storytelling. So there's fairy tales, there's folk tales, there's myths, there's legends, and there's fables. And for example, fables are very simple. There's the turtle and the rabbit, and the story there is do not underestimate your weak opponent. There's the story of the ant and the grasshopper, and the moral of the story is plan ahead for the winter, etc. But fairy tales are a little bit more complex. And fairy tales can be used to help children solve psychological issues. Many therapists have something called story time, and they use it to engage children and let them explore sibling rivalry, Oedipal conflicts with parents, etc. And this is a resource to explore the inner world of the child. So young children need to learn right from wrong, good from bad, and these simple stories help them understand. But it's important that small kids are exposed to stories that make sense. So the fiction for children does not pretend to be real, and that is one of the reasons why many of the main characters are animals. But for young adults, the stories can be more elaborate, and the more sophisticated the reader, then the more sophisticated the detail in the story. And young adults like fantasy, science fiction, utopian stories, and they like Gothic literature. These genres are not promoted among young children because they interfere with the perception of reality. So you first need to understand reality, and then you can understand fantasy, because fantasy is based on reality. So these unreal, fantastic worlds can be an opportunity for an escape. And so for young children, it's better they just understand reality first. That's one of the reasons why Alice in Wonderland or Harry Potter or 1984, many of those books have been banned in certain countries because they don't want young children to be exploring those fantastic worlds. Anyway, so traditional fiction follows the order of reality. It follows the reason and the logic. It follows time and space, so it makes sense. But science fiction doesn't have to make sense. There's time travel. There's superpowers for heroes. There's crossing among dimensions. And so the rules change. But one of the advantages about science fiction and fantasy is that in the supernatural, you can explore clairvoyance, telepathy, and these other unrealistic and invisible worlds. But the interesting thing in the psychological aspect is that they're free from social norms. And so these stories, the supernatural stories, are like the dream world, and real feelings can come up from the subconscious. So Carl Jung believed, like Joseph Campbell, that the myth is linked to the human psyche. There's psychology underneath the myth. And so the myth is a form of folk therapy. It's like popular therapy. It's a safe space to explore mental illness. And another great advantage is that the left brain is used for logical, analytical thinking, but the right brain is used for metaphorical approach. It is used for intuition, and it can help create new brain connections. So story, myth, and fantasy are psychologically therapeutic, and they reach us through the right brain. So the Gothic genre is rooted in the fairy tale, but it reaches higher levels of consciousness. It involves medieval romance and also a modern novel. In the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell, there's 3 stages. There's first separation, then there's initiation, and then there's the return of the hero, changed. But in Gothic literature, the hero is an anti-hero. So what really happens is that the genre separates from literary tradition, it creates a new narrative, and the result is a new structure. So there's no happy ending, and the hero becomes the villain. Throughout the story, the hero becomes the villain. So Shirley Jackson is a Gothic writer because she writes the anti-fairy tale. So the fairy tales, the prince is the one that's the hero, and the princess is captured, poisoned, asleep, but she's the prize. She's the target, she's the goal, she's the reward for the transformed hero. Shirley Jackson does not write the heroine's journey. She writes a Gothic tale where the heroine becomes the villain. For example, in the lottery, when Tess Hutchinson wins the lottery, she's stoned to death. She has stoned others to death, and now it is her turn to feed the system. In Dark Tales, Miss Strangeworth is trapped in her small little town, following the rules and pretending to be kind. But in reality, she's repressed, and when she writes her mean, anonymous letters, she spreads her venom from behind the barrier. In Handsome Man, the novel, Natalie White is home. Then that's her first world, her orderly world. Then she goes to college. That's where the transformation is supposed to happen. And that's where she meets the otherness, the foreign, the strange, the new. But she doesn't come back changed. She gets lost. She becomes mentally ill, she becomes schizophrenic, and she just loses contact with reality. In The Haunting of Hill House, Eleanor decides to go into an experiment. She pursues a new life, but then the house is haunted, and she cannot understand the boundaries between fantasy and reality, and she can't escape the house. In We Used to Live in the Castle, Mary Cat stays in the other world. And so Natalie, Eleanor, and Mary Cat are the failed hero. It is the evil environment that transformed the main characters, and in Gothic literature, the objective is to question culture, and then the environment is the one that corrupts the main character. So the questioning, the transformation is against the environment. So one of the subjects that we find in Shirley Jackson's literature is the nuclear family, the domestic family, and here she's constantly questioning the dysfunctional families. There's tyrant fathers like Hugh Crane in the Haunting of Hill House. Then there's the manipulative mother like Eleanor's sick mother, and there's the spoiled egocentric children like Mary Cat. The Gothic family is disrupted by individualism, but a home where there's anarchy, where there's no authority, becomes an anarchy, a home in anarchy, like We Used to Live in the Castle. The castle is mocking the failed dream family. So the post-war individualism promotes a nuclear family as the source of evil that turns the hero into villain. So who is the anti-hero? The housewife. The housewife becomes the villain because many of Jackson's heroes, they were slaves, domestic slaves, trying to create the dream home. They felt like the trapped princess, and the fairy tale turned into a horror story. So motherhood was the dungeon created by society, but Jackson is only describing the dungeon, but she does not explain how to escape the dragons. She describes how she lives among savages and how she's racing demons. So they saw her as a role model, her writers and her fans saw her as a role model, but she gave them a sense of community and a sense of belonging, and they found relief in knowing that they were not perfect housewives. When they read Jackson's stories, they felt like free thinkers because at least they created resistance to the system in their minds. So Jackson's work is autobiographical, and it's also fiction, and she uses the supernatural to exhibit the monster child and the horror inside the household. As she writes about domesticity, Jackson explores her bright side and her dark side as a woman, as a mother, and as a writer. Jackson's greatest attribute is creating believable characters. So the credibility of the character is interconnected with familiar experiences that we have. The reader's psychological response to fictional characters is based on psychological response to real people. And Jackson's characters are believable because they come from her own experience. So in the real world, everything we do doesn't have a meaning, but in fiction, everything that's written has a meaning, and it's designed to help us get to know the character and move the drama. So fictional characters are representative, they're representational, and the reader knows that we're talking about an inhabited reality, but we know that it is an invented character. So fiction has the power to shed a new light into the lives of writers and readers. It might be useful to compare Shirley Jackson to another Gothic writer, for example, Charles Dickens. And what's interesting in Dickens, characters find freedom in their solitude. And in Jackson's, characters become mad. They lose their mind. Dickens' characters find silence and solitude make their lives beautiful, and in Jackson, their solitude brings them isolation and anxiety. So the dearest fictional characters are usually role models. The narrative builds a world where the character exists to make decisions that show their personality, their true nature. Gothic characters are the product of an evil environment, but they are still anti-heroes. In fiction, characters are always showing us who they are. Jackson's characters are unreliable because they're mentally ill. One of the privileges fiction writers have is that characters don't have to explain why they do something as long as the action supports the drama. But if the writer abuses this privilege, the characters suffer. Fiction is free, but only to tell the truth. If fiction does not make sense, the reader will lose interest. People behave in ways that are connected to their circumstances in reality and in fiction. So Jackson's life did not have a resolution, and neither did her characters. Fictional narratives should be used to find resolutions for the writers and for the readers. What is valuable to enable a plot might not be valuable to create a pathway to explore a human concern. Maybe if Jackson was not so committed to sell and entertain, she could have helped her heroines come back changed, like the hero. The heroine could have been the hero, and they could have come back to transform the world they left behind. Thank you.